Welcome to today's City Club of Boise virtual conversation with Congressman Mike Simpson. I'm Dr. Katherine Himes, City Club of Boise board member, director of the University of Idaho McClure Center for Public Policy Research, and today's moderator. Thank you for being with us today. I want to welcome our radio listeners who will be joining us at a later date via Boise State Public Radio on KBSX 91.5 and its affiliates throughout Southern Idaho and Northern Nevada. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. Today's forum is available for our audience in large part because of our City Club partners and sponsors. I would like to take time to thank a few of these organizations that help us achieve our mission to ensure compelling conversations, engaged citizens, and a dynamic community. Our premier sponsor is Northwest Nazarene University and the NNU College of Business. Our annual sponsor is the University of Idaho. We also receive support from our forum series sponsors, AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Climatech Corporation, Echelon Group, Micron, Pacific Source Health Plans, Small Mine Development, and St. Luke's Health System. City Club of Boise receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. Thanks also to our media partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, 670 KBOI, Idaho Statesman, and Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, BSU and NNU. Finally, I would like to thank the members of City Club of Boise, the individuals who and organizations that understand the need to find common ground, listen, seek shared solutions, and learn from and respect each other. City Club of Boise members are foundational to our community. Thank you for your support. If you are listening and not yet a member, then I encourage you to join today. Please remember that there will be an opportunity for our speaker to respond to your questions. You can use the Q&A function of Zoom, just type your question, or you can email your question to morgan@cityclubofboise.org and it will be provided to me. I will do my best to present each question and may group similar inquiries together in the interest of time. City Club of Boise is so fortunate to be joined today by Congressman Mike Simpson. Congressman Simpson will discuss his recent proposal, which seeks to address what he describes as an unsustainable cycle of conflicts over salmon and energy. For over 30 years, lawsuits, appeals, salmon management directives, and endless spending have prevailed, while salmon, energy, agriculture, and transportation interests continue to suffer. Simpson's concept is a proposal, in his words, to break that cycle and deliver certainty and security to the Northwest without picking winners and losers. Before introducing Congressman Simpson, we will watch, and for our radio audience, listen to a brief video that he created to describe his proposal.
Idaho salmon are wonders of nature, ultra-marathoners that make an 1,800-mile round trip from Idaho's highest mountains to the Pacific and back, climbing 1.3 miles in altitude in the process. Our high-elevation rivers and streams possess some of the coldest, cleanest, and nutrient-rich spawning grounds. But the historical plentiful runs of the Snake and Salmon rivers are no more. In 2019, just 3,763 wild adult spring Chinook salmon returned to spawn in Idaho, about 4% of the historical total, despite spending over $17 billion on salmon recovery and management.
And now, while the Salmon River is raging with spring runoff, a few wild sockeye smolts are riding that wave.
Another one?
When they reach the 8 slackwater pools that have replaced the naturally flowing river system, warm water, predators, and the stress of the hydroelectric turbines will kill most of them.
The current system is clearly not working, so we are asking some very difficult what-if questions. What if the dams came out? What if we were able to replace the energy from the dams? What if we came up with different ways of transporting grain? What if we created new economic engines for our communities? So for the past 3 years, we've conducted over 300 meetings with smart, dedicated people on all sides of the Northwest Salmon Dam issue. We came to realize the complexities and challenges that have prevented the Northwest from finding workable solutions. Since 1937, 8 hydroelectric dams have been built on the lower Columbia and Snake Rivers, providing clean, reliable, low-cost energy throughout the Northwest. Humans have adapted, producing energy, transporting agricultural goods at lower costs, and creating irrigation and recreational opportunities. But unfortunately, the salmon haven't adapted. The dams create barriers to passage and produce slow-moving reservoirs of water that imperil their existence. Other factors are also working against the salmon, including poor ocean conditions and warm rivers from climate change. My staff and I approached this challenge with the idea that there must be a way to restore Idaho salmon and keep the 4 lower Snake River dams. But after exhausting dozens of possible solutions, we weren't able to find one that could control poor ocean conditions, warming rivers, and the 4 lower Snake dams. In the end, we realized there is no viable path that can allow us to keep the dams in place. I don't claim to know what the best answer is for each sector. However, I do know that if we give the farmers, bargers, ports, the BPA, and communities the necessary resources, each sector can develop a certainty and security, putting the Northwest and Idaho salmon on a path to sustained viability. Working together as a delegation, and with the governors, stakeholders, and conservationists, we can create a Northwest solution that ends the salmon wars and puts the Northwest and our energy systems on a certain, secure, and viable path for decades and restores Idaho salmon. We must also not forget the Columbia Basin tribes. Their culture and heritage revolved around the return of salmon. We must make these tribes equal partners in the solution, and going forward, they must be co-equal partners in salmon restoration. I want to be clear that I'm not certain removing these dams will restore Idaho's salmon and prevent their extinction. But I am certain that if we do not take this course of action, we are condemning Idaho's salmon to extinction.
It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Congressman Mike Simpson. Congressman Simpson is serving his 11th term in the House of Representatives for Idaho's 2nd Congressional District. He serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Energy and Water Development. He also serves on the Interior and Environment Subcommittee. These committees have jurisdiction over funding for a number of projects critical to Idaho. Congressman Simpson has authored bills that address topics as diverse as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, to the Boulder White Clouds Wilderness, to the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act. His political career began in 1980 when he was elected to the Blackfoot City Council. In 1984, he was elected to the Idaho legislature and served until 1998, the last 6 years as Speaker. Congressman Simpson was born in Burley, Idaho, and raised in Blackfoot. He graduated from Utah State University and earned his DMD from Washington University School of Dental Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. After graduation, he joined his father and uncle at the Simpson family dental practice in Blackfoot. Congressman Simpson married his high school sweetheart, Kathy, and they have been married for almost 50 years. He is an avid golfer and reader who also enjoys painting and experiencing the exceptional scenery Idaho has to offer with Kathy and their dog, Charlie. Congressman, we look forward to your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thanks City Club for hosting this lecture series that we're doing and what we're proposing here. First, let me say, what we've put out is a concept. It's not legislation. We haven't drafted anything yet. And the reason we put it out is because we thought this was a debate that needed to happen in the Pacific Northwest. The And we wanted to get input from the public on what this concept would entail, and listen to people. As said in the video, we've had over 300 meetings. In fact, if you add it up now, it's about 500 meetings we've had with various stakeholders in the Pacific Northwest. And we were trying to address essentially 4 fundamental questions. One is dealing with the BPA and the financial challenges that they face. How do we make them sustainable for the future and competitive in the future? The second is, how do we end the salmon wars, the endless litigation that goes on, and how do we spend that money instead of in court on actually restoring salmon runs and making the stakeholders whole? And the third is saving Idaho's endangered salmon from becoming extinct. And then the fourth question is, if you're going to save salmon from becoming extinct, every fish biologist that I've talked to, says that you're going to have to remove the lower Snake River dams, those 4 dams. And if you're going to do that, what challenges does that present, and how do you make the stakeholders whole in this process? So we spent an awful lot of time asking those questions of the stakeholders, and what would it take to make them whole? All of these issues, what we found is they're intimately intertwined. When you pull a string in one area, it pulls a string in another area. And so you have to deal with all of them. That's why this has become such a large, if you will, proposal that encompasses so much. And that's why we call it the Pacific Northwest in transition, because we are transitioning. And that's something that we're going to look forward to in the future. Let me talk for just a second about BPA. I said yesterday on a webinar like this that BPA isn't the lowest cost producer of energy in the Pacific Northwest. And I was challenged later on in a call saying, wait a minute, hydropower is the lowest cost producer. It is. Hydropower is the cheapest power you can produce. It doesn't cost much money to run water through a turbine. The question is the BPA power that you receive the lowest cost? And why are BPA power rates continuing to go up? And it's because of all the ancillary costs that we put on the BPA. They're in charge of weatherization programs in the Pacific Northwest. They have a residential exchange rate that costs BPA customers about $250 million a year. They spend about $700 to $750 million a year in salmon recovery and fish mitigation and so forth. So it's all the ancillary costs that cause the BPA power to continue to go up. The other thing is that they are reaching the limit in their borrowing authority with the Treasury. And while they will tell you, and it's absolutely true, they have never missed a Treasury payment, the way they do it is by extending their debt out. So while their payments to the Treasury get made, their debt continues to increase. It's sort of like paying off your mortgage with your credit card and then saying your mortgage is going down. Well, that's true, but your debt continues to go up. So I think we've got to make the BPA sustainable and competitive for the future, and that's one of the main goals that we were trying to focus on when we came up with this concept. Now let's go to the slides, and I'll walk you through these slides before we start answering some questions that people may have.
Congressman, just a second here. It sounds like we may be having a technical difficulty with the slides. So I will use this moment to just remind our radio listeners that you are listening to a City Club of Boise virtual conversation with Congressman Mike Simpson focused on his salmon and his energy concept. It sounds like Zoom is malfunctioning for us today, and we're unable to share the slides.
Okay.
So is that all right to proceed without them? Okay.
That's right. That's okay. Let me go through what they are, and I'll talk about them as I go through them. We all know that the status quo isn't working. The Northwest is caught in this cycle of poor salmon runs and endless litigation. The federal government has already spent about $17 billion trying to recover salmon, and the one thing we know is it hasn't recovered salmon. It isn't working. As I said, this concept seeks to break that cycle, giving some much needed security and certainty for our stakeholders and our agricultural community in the future. The one slide that I did want to show you that you can almost see better on a map, but I will describe to you, is that the reason that the salmon runs in Idaho are going extinct I think as you talk to every fish biologist, that what they will tell you is what's called the smolt to adult ratio, the SARS, is the determination of how healthy a salmon run is. And it needs to be between 4 and 6 for a truly sustainable, healthy salmon run. Needs to be above 2 in order to maintain the current population of salmon runs. If it falls below 2, you're headed toward extinction. If you look at the SARS ratio, it seems like we've got slides up now.
Yeah, Morgan was not able to get it to work, but if you can see it off my computer, then we're doing really well.
Okay, if everybody can see that, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
This is the map I wanted to show you. And the SARS ratio, as I said, needs to be above 2 and preferably between 4 and 6. If you look at the salmon runs as they come up the Columbia River, those fish that pass over the first 3 dams and enter the John Day watershed, their SARS ratio is about 3.5, and that is a healthy, sustainable salmon population. Once they go over the 4th dam and enter the Yakima Basin, it's about a 2.4% SARS rate. Then those fish that turn to the west or turn to the east and go up the salmon or the lower Snake River have to pass 4 more dams. After they get over the last dam, the 8th dam on that list, our SARS ratio is below 1%. It's about 0.8%, which is a certain path for extinction. And so these are the same fish that have to pass the first 4 dams. It's just that 8 dams are too many. And consequently, that's why you're seeing Idaho salmon runs go on the path of extinction. Let's see the next slide. The one thing that this proposal, this concept envisions, and it's the first one that has been proposed out of all of those that have been done over the last 25 or 30 years, is the fact that the lower Snake dams are very valuable. They produce energy and transportation for our agricultural community. They provide clean, low-cost, renewable hydropower that is on demand, and that's important. Without question, these 4 lower Snake dams provide significant benefits for the Pacific Northwest, and to replace these dams would be very expensive. Next slide. How do we end the salmon wars? Salmon wars are almost always caused, and the litigation is almost always caused by the relicensing of dams. The example I give is that if you look at the Hell's Canyon complex that is being relicensed by Idaho Power, they started that relicensing process when I was in the state legislature over 25 years ago. So far, they've spent 3 times as much as it cost to relicense these dams as it cost to build those dams. And they still haven't got the licenses done yet. That's because of endless litigation and other things that continue and cost the relicensing of these dams much more than it would normally cost. So what we've done in this proposal is to end the endless litigation. We've said that, okay, every dam that produces over 5 megawatts of power in the Columbia Basin, their license is extended automatically for 35 to 50 years. It would halt the litigation, and they would be exempt because their license would be extended from lawsuits under the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Environmental Policy Act for that period of 35 to 50 years, depending on when their license came due. Now, I find it interesting that there are some what I will call extreme environmental groups in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington and Oregon mainly, that are opposed to this plan. The reason that they're opposed to it is because they don't want to give up their right to sue. We've created a cottage industry where some organizations actually make a profit by suing under the EJA funds and so forth, and they don't want to give up that right to sue. And that kind of tells you what their game plan for the future is. They're going to sue every time a dam comes up for relicensing. Well, we take away that ability. And one of the keys here was when we started this, we had to go to the proponents, that are the individuals and organizations that are always doing the suing, or at least involved in a lot of the lawsuits. That's the state of Oregon, some of the environmental groups, some of the Indian tribes, and talk to them about, listen, if we do this, and if we can remove the dams and help restore Idaho salmon runs, can we end the lawsuits? They agreed to that. And that's kind of surprising that they agreed to this end of litigation in this process. Next slide. We're going to lose about 300 megawatts of power by taking these dams out. They generally produce 1,500 to 1,800 megawatts of power, average usage, from what I understand. But they have the potential to produce 3,000 megawatts of power. The reality is you can replace this power. You can replace it by doing either pump storage. You can replace it by using battery technology. And as I talk to the battery people, they tell me it is amazing what is happening in the world of batteries. And I don't know if any of you saw what Elon Musk was proposing in Houston, Texas, because of the Texas crisis that just happened. But it has to be firm power. That means small modular reactors and other things that you could put at the Hanford site. You could replace this power. I don't think it would be difficult to do that, but it would be expensive. And that's why we give $10 billion to the BPA to replace this power that would be lost by the dams with firm power. And that would, and none of these dams would come out until that power is in place. That's why the dam removal in this proposal doesn't occur for another 10 years until 2030. Because all of these things have to be in place, as I said, before you start taking the dams out. Next slide. Obviously, agriculture in Idaho is very important. I spent my life and my career in Washington trying to make sure that we have a strong and healthy agricultural community and doing everything I can to make sure that they're sustainable for the future. It's the lifeblood of Idaho. This concept provides, I think, certainty, security, and legal protections to farmers in the Pacific Northwest. This concept contains funds to help irrigators retool and refigure and extend their water systems, particularly those in Washington and stuff, that they can still pump water to their fields in Washington. Next slide. It also creates a voluntary watershed partnership program. And I did find this interesting when I read through the salmon work group that the governor put together and their recommendations. Some of the things that they're proposing in here are actually in our proposed concept here. We can create a clean river and increase the water quality and quantity to protect farmers in this process. It creates as I said, a watershed partnership program. Those participating in this voluntary partnership, it would be voluntary, they'll receive a 25-year exemption from the Clean Water Act or the Endangered Species Act related to the water issues in their basin if they participate in this clean water initiative. It gives them that safe harbor that they need for the next 25 years, the length of this program. It would be the State Department of Agriculture and Resources will oversee the program in each respective state. So it addresses not just the Snake River Basin and the Upper Snake River Basin, but also other basins like the Willamette or the John Day or the Yakima Valley also, so that they can clean up that water. Because one of the keys is not just having water, but having good, clean, cool water for these fish. Next slide. If the dams are taking out, when we look at barging and transportation, one of the benefits that Idaho farmers, particularly those on the Palouse, they ship 95 million bushels of grain to the Tri-Cities and to Portland by barging. It's at a cheaper cost than they can ship grain by rail or by truck. What this fund does, what this proposal does, and this is an idea that we came up with, but mainly we want the agricultural community to come up with their own plan if they find this one not acceptable. But what it does is put $3.6 billion into a fund that is managed by the State Department of Agriculture in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And it's overseen by a board of producers. Now, if you put that money into a fund, getting Treasury interest rates, if you did that next year, by the time it was necessary to use that fund, that would be about $5 billion. You could take the interest off that $5 billion, help with the shipping costs so that they could ship by train or by truck, and it would actually cost the producer less to ship their grain using that with the subsidy of the interest off this fund than it costs now to barge. So we can get grain down the river to the Tri-Cities or to Portland cheaper for farmers than it is today. But it's a change, and it's something that they would have to accept, and they may come up with a better idea. But what we want to do is make sure that they have the resources that they can address this issue in the best way that they see fit. And that's why we put this $3.6 billion cost into this. Next slide. The reason we're doing this is not because of me and you. I don't think salmon are going to go extinct in the Pacific Northwest, or Idaho salmon runs are going to go extinct before I die, or before many of you die. Fish biologists will tell us maybe we've got 4 generations of salmon, which is about 20 years before they'll go extinct. We're really doing this for future generations. We all know that the system currently is not working. It's, as I said, leading to the endless litigation and inefficient spending on salmon recovery and techniques. I don't want to criticize the Northwest Power Planning Council that is in charge of salmon recovery and stuff. They've done a great job of keeping them off the extinction list so far. But the reality is the numbers are declining, and they will be extinct. Our children won't have the opportunity to enjoy the salmon and the iconic species of the Pacific Northwest unless we do something about it. I know this is difficult. This is a hard conversation. If it was easy, this would have already been solved. There have been, over the years, the best we can tell, over 25 different collaborative organizations or groups or initiatives that have taken place to try to solve this problem. They all run up against the issue of dams. And once they hit the issue of dams, then things break down. They've made many good recommendations. The working group that the Governor Little put together made some great recommendations, things that I think we ought to be doing, regardless of what happens with this proposal and stuff. But they all stop short of what I think is the fundamental need, and that is to remove these dams if we are going to save salmon in the Pacific Northwest. The question is, can we do it and make the stakeholders whole? I know change is hard. Human beings are animals that like certainty and security, and they like to know that the sun is going to come up the same place today that it did yesterday. And change is difficult for all of us. But I think we need to be looking at what we want the Pacific Northwest and our environment to look like in 20, 30, 50 years from now. Because the decisions that we're making today are the decisions that are going to make those determinations. So that's why we proposed this, why we put it out there to let people look at it. What I've said is what I would like is people to put down their pitchforks and stop and consider what we're proposing. Look at it and see if there are things that we haven't considered that we should be considering, and that type of thing before we ever start drafting any legislation. So that would be down the road at some point in time after we've received input. And believe me, I do 3 or 4 or 5 of these types of meetings almost every day. So we're reaching out to all the stakeholders across the Pacific Northwest, both in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, trying to get their input and their thoughts. But it takes a minute for people to sit back and say, okay, what exactly are we proposing, and what exactly do we want the future to look like? So that's, in general terms, what the concept is. Katherine, I'd be happy to try to answer questions that people have, because it's much more complicated. It's not, with the video that we showed, it looks like it's all about salmon. And the reality is, if there were no salmon, if they were either extinct or there had never been salmon there, we wouldn't be having this debate. But the reality is the iconic species in the Pacific Northwest. I think we owe it to our future generations to try to solve this problem.
Congressman Simpson, thanks so much for sharing the details of your proposal. As you can only imagine, we have a lot of questions from those who are joining us today. Before we turn to those questions, I'm just going to remind our radio listeners that you are listening to a City Club of Boise virtual conversation with Congressman Mike Simpson, focused on his salmon and energy concept. One of the questions is the process of engagement. You talked about almost 500 people that you and your staff met with to really put together the proposal. Can you talk a little bit about what that process of engagement looked like? How many years did you spend on this before sharing the proposal?
Sure. It's 500 organizations and individuals. So it's a lot more people than just 500. But they've been through either phone conversations, personal meetings, that type of thing, videos, seminars, and that type of stuff that we've met with people to talk about this. I'm not a fish biologist. I'm not a transportation expert. I'm not an energy expert. So we rely on those people that are, and that's why we contacted them and said, okay, what happens if we do X, Y, or Z? And what are the challenges that presents? We've talked to people that are knowledgeable in the various fields, and this has been going on for about 3 years. That we've been talking to these individuals. We actually started the conversation when we kind of got this concept in rough form in our minds of what we thought we wanted to do or to look at. We started by looking at the proponents of the litigation and said, if we're gonna do something like this, we've got to be certain that we can end the salmon wars. So we went to the tribes, we went to the state of Oregon, we went to the environmental groups that are in the lawsuits all the time and said, how can we do this and end these salmon wars? And that's how we started. But it's a continuing process. I've got meetings set up and at different conferences and so forth for the next several months. So we'll be discussing this with many more people because we want to learn from it and hear what people have to say about it.
Thank you. So a lot of Idahoans have heard about the Governor's Salmon Work Group, whose work just concluded. They've heard about the Columbia Basin Collaborative, which is a new effort that includes Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and the Sovereigns. How does your proposal connect to and or complement these efforts?
Well, I've read through the Governor's Salmon Work Group. I think they did a great job. They make some really solid recommendations in there. This should be undertaken regardless of how any of this turns out. And I hope they do that, and I'll work with them to see that we can do it. But as I read through it, I noticed some of their recommendations were actually things that we're proposing in this concept that we've put out. As I mentioned earlier, the watershed partnerships that we are developing and creating a safe harbor for the agricultural producers that participate in this is part of what our concept is. And so there are a lot of those recommendations that I think will be taken into consideration as we mature this product that we've put out. The governor's collaborative of the 4 states that they have put out, they've had their first meeting, and I understand they took about half the time in that meeting talking about our concept of what we're proposing. I've talked to some of the individuals that are in that group, particularly from Oregon, about it, and they want to pursue it. But it always, even with the governor's working group, they weren't able to come to a conclusion on whether the dams need to come out to save salmon or not. No other collaborative I've ever seen has been able to come to a conclusion on that. And it's just really tough to build consensus on that issue. So I compliment the work that they did do, but I think they stopped short of fully recovering salmon.
Thank you. So let's talk about this proposal. It's not a bill. Why did you put these ideas forward as a proposal, and how would this potentially become a bill? What does that process look like?
Well, as I said earlier, we put it together as a concept, as a proposal for people to comment on. And even since I think it was February 6th, we released it, so about 2 months ago, we've received a lot of input from people who have asked good questions that I just didn't have the answer to yet, that I hadn't really thought of. And so that's why we put it out as a proposal rather than a bill. If you have a piece of legislation that's almost like, okay, this is what we're going to move with and we're ready to go and ready to introduce it and stuff, we're not ready for that. We still are learning the issues, and that's why we wanted people to comment on it and to look at it and not just come to say, oh, this is another dam removal proposal. So hell no, we're never going to do that. To look at it in general, in concept. You know, someone said to me the other day, and I happen to agree with this, it's not a matter of if these dams come out. It's a matter of when these dams come out. I think that's absolutely true. Eventually they will come out. The Endangered Species Act trumps almost everything. I don't know of a time that we've been able to defeat the Endangered Species Act, or even if we should defeat the Endangered Species Act. It trumps things, because when you're talking about an endangered species, once it goes extinct, there's no way you bring it back. Only God can do that. So it is a kind of a final decision. And that's why the Endangered Species Act is so strong. And if these salmon are going extinct, which I think everybody that looks at them says they are, a court will require that we do everything we can possibly to solve them. Now, there are some other issues that have happened in the past that lead us to look forward into what we're proposing here and look down the road. One is the spotted owl issue. You saw in the Pacific Northwest, the spotted owl issue years ago, particularly in Oregon. The resource people were told, if you just fight this, just keep fighting this, we'll win in the long run. Well, they didn't. And consequently, all those communities that had sawmills and depended on that timber, they were devastated. Many jobs were lost in the timber industry because of the spotted owl controversy, because they wouldn't sit down and work out a compromise where they could still survive. The other one that I would recommend people look at is the Klamath Basin. For years, in fact, one of the first field trips I went on was to the Klamath Basin to hold a hearing with Greg Walden. And they've been working on this for 25 or 30 years about removing the dams on the Klamath River and restoring the salmon runs there. Finally, the agricultural producers, the Indian tribes, the environmentalists came to an agreement. And it involved the Indians subordinating their water rights to the agricultural producers. The Indians in return would have gotten some timberland that they could manage and so forth. And the environmentalists were happy that the dams were coming out. They brought that concept to Congress. Congress wouldn't pass it. This was just last year. So guess what's happening now? Those dams are coming out. By 2024, the dams will be removed, and no one is getting compensated for that. Not the agricultural producers, not the tribes, not anyone. I don't want Idaho and the Pacific Northwest to be Klamath. That's a new verb we've come up with. Be Klamath or spotted owl, if you will. So that's the reason that we're looking at this, and that's why it is so broad-based. It's not just about salmon. It's about, as I said, the BPA. It's about other things in the Pacific Northwest.
Congressman, you mentioned that people have the opportunity to comment on the proposal now. As you've been receiving comments, as you've continued to talk to these groups, these individuals, what are some areas with hesitation? People or organizations just giving pause to this proposal. What are some concerns?
Well, as I said earlier, change is difficult for anybody. Someone told me one time when I was giving a speech one time, you got to remember that everything we do on the lower Snake and Columbia River, we can do differently. Those are choices we make. They were choices we made to put the dams in. They can be choices we make to take the dams out. They can, but they're choices that we choose to make. Salmon don't have a choice. They need a river. Right now, it's a mistake to call the lower Snake River a river. All it is a series of pools behind dams, which, as I said, create slow-moving waters, which endanger the salmon, higher temperatures, which endanger the salmon, and predators, increased predation that endangers the salmon. And consequently, it is unhealthy for returning salmon runs to Idaho. So those are some of the issues, but obviously, people have built up communities of interest around those dams, whether it's recreational, whether it's barging the grain down the river or other products down the river. All of those types of things have been built up over the last 25 or 30 years, 50 years since these dams went in. And trying to change is difficult, but we have to view it, I think, differently because the Pacific Northwest is in transition.
I'm going to shift a little bit. There's a question about the upper Snake River. So far we've been talking about the lower Snake River, the dams located on the lower Snake. But the question here is about the upper Snake. So above the Hells Canyon complex, the part of the Snake that goes across the southern part of the state. And the question is about the possibility of returning anadromous fish to that part of the ecosystem.
Well, you don't have, if the Hells Canyon complex doesn't have fish passage as other dams in the Pacific Northwest. Some people have said, well, should take out the Hells Canyon complex and the Warshak Dam. Some of my Washington friends who are opposed to this, I said, okay, then let's look at Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph Dam. You're not going to remove all the dams in the Pacific Northwest. The important part, I think, of the upper Snake River is that we need to provide clean, fresh water, and we can do that through these watershed partnerships that we're developing. What we're trying to do here is to open up central Idaho, which is the best habitat for salmon. And you would be amazed at the amount of acreage and miles of river that get opened up just by opening up, by removing those dams and opening up the Snake River to salmon passage. It is all of central Idaho, and that is the best habitat there is for salmon.
Thank you, Congressman. There are a lot of questions about transportation options for grain, other Northwest products, and so really wanting to learn more about transportation and what are those next steps. When you talk about how farmers and others would come together and they could propose something that's different than what's in your proposal, what does that look like? How do you get from an idea to an action plan around transportation in particular, and some questions about what incentives are there besides financial?
Well, what you'd have to do is make sure that they have the resources if they come up with a different plan in transportation. And what that would mean is there would be more, you'd be putting more trucks on the road with grain in them, or more rail cars. So you might have to deal with the infrastructure of the roads or the rails to do that. People have said to me, well, you're going to put 1.2 million pounds of carbon in the air if you do that, because transporting it by barge is relatively carbon free, not totally, but relatively carbon free compared to trucks and trains. But as I talk to the trucking industry, and I spent some time just recently talking to them, they tell me they're not sure that you're going to have diesel trucks on the road in 10 or 15 years. Battery technology is coming up so rapidly with them that you're going to see more and more semis battery operated. The initial investment in one of those semis is what's stopping it right now. But the length of the service of a truck, you can actually substantially reduce your costs by having a battery powered truck. And I think you're going to see more and more of those. That's the way our economy is going. The same thing is true of trains. So it may require some additional investment in the infrastructure, in the roads infrastructure and in the rail infrastructure to do this. But I have no doubt that we can get grain down the river at a cheaper price than what they're currently paying, or at least as cheap a price as they're currently paying, and still not add to the carbon in the atmosphere.
Thank you. We have some questions about Lewiston and Lewiston's future economy. Right now, the economy is built around a lot of things, including the port. And if the port is different through the future, through this proposal, what do you see for Lewiston's economy? What does that look like? Are there dollars in your proposal to help bolster that region?
Certainly there are. The Port of Lewiston's annual budget is about $1.9 million. I think they employ something like 7 full-time employees or something like that in that range. But it is an important part of Lewiston. There's money in this for river restoration for Lewiston. There's also money in there to create a research park with PNNL, with Lewiston Clarkston, with the University of Idaho and the University of Washington. I think we can expand their economy into different arenas or give them the opportunity to do that. That would be beneficial for them in the long run. This is a chance, I think, that they would, it would be a mistake for them to pass up, because I think it's going to be important for Lewiston in the future. But certainly that was one of our considerations when we were looking at this.
Great, thank you. So a lot of questions coming in around the politics of this, not just what happens to different stakeholders or a particular economy, but what about the reaction from the rest of Idaho's delegation? It sounds like delegation and the governor maybe have a different view of this proposal. So what's happening behind the scenes to socialize this more, to build that coalition?
Well, we have talked with obviously all of our delegation and most of the other representatives or senators in the Pacific Northwest, with all of the governors, and what it is right now is a great deal of caution. They kind of want to see what the public reaction is and if this has legs or not. And they're getting pressure from different outside groups and so forth. And I understand that. I have not asked anyone to jump on board and rah this proposal. What I've asked them to do is step back and take a look at it and see if there's something that we can work with here as we move forward. So I haven't expected them to get on board with it, nor have I asked them to, but we have presented it to them, and a lot of them have said, well, kind of interesting. Let's see what happens and see what the public's reaction is. I mean, after all, we're all politicians, and we want to know what the public reaction is going to do before we take a major step like this.
Right. And so, when you think about the importance of this bill, or excuse me, the importance of the proposal, casting it really as the future of the Pacific Northwest, it's not just Idaho. And it's interesting that you're a congressman from Idaho who is putting forth a proposal that's really focused on the Northwest. What are some of the reactions from the senators and the representatives in Oregon, in Washington, and in Montana?
Well, I honestly haven't talked to anybody in Montana yet, which we've got to do. We just got a new governor up there. He was a colleague of mine, Gianforte, in Congress. And so I haven't really spent much time with him because he's getting his administration in order. But we have spent a lot of time talking with Kate Brown in Washington, or in Oregon, and with Jay Inslee and his staff in Washington. And the reaction, I will say, especially of Kate Brown in Oregon, has been, she's been calling her members of Congress and saying, hey, you guys need to step back and look at this real seriously, and so forth. There are some members of Congress that are interested in, and are very interested in what we're doing, whether it's Earl Blumenauer from Portland or others. But I think everybody, as I said, is taking a very cautious response. If we're going to do something like this, it's important to do it, I think, now, because the Pacific Northwest delegation probably has more power in Congress right now than we have had in many, many years, or will have in the future. We've got Ron Wyden, who is chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Mike Crapo is the vice chairman of that committee. We've got Patty Murray, who is in Senate leadership. We've got Marie Cantwell, who is chairwoman of one of the committees in the Senate that deals with natural resources. So we've got a pretty, powerful delegation as a Pacific Northwest delegation if we were going to get something like this done. And if you look at the $33.5 billion that we estimate that it would take to do this plan, the Biden administration is going to propose, we haven't seen it yet, an infrastructure package. If they were to put something like this, or the funding for this, even if we didn't have the legislation done yet, if we had the funding for this put aside, that's about 1.5 to 1.75% of what they are totally looking at in terms of an infrastructure package. I don't think that's too much to ask for the Pacific Northwest. But you bring up one other interesting question. You said, why is a congressman from Idaho doing this? I'm from the 2nd District of Idaho. The reason I'm looking at infrastructure in the state of Washington is because it's those dams in Washington that are killing Idaho salmon that populate my district. The other thing is that when we started looking at this, and this sounds kind of parochial, and maybe it is that it seems to me like the costs of those dams are borne by Idaho's constituents. We flush 487,000 acre feet of water down the river every year to restore salmon runs. The one thing it hasn't done is restore salmon runs, but that's 487,000 acre feet of water that is not available for irrigation in Idaho. That's not available to recharge our aquifer in Idaho. And so that cost is borne by us. It's the salmon runs that come to Idaho that are going to go extinct. That cost is borne by us. The benefits go to the state of Washington, frankly. You know how much power we get out of the dams? About 8% of that comes to Idaho. We get cheaper barging transportation. We can get around that. We can make transportation cheaper for shippers, as we've talked about earlier. But does it seem right to you that Idaho pays the costs of the dams and the benefits go somewhere else? That just doesn't make sense to me.
And Congressman Simpson, can you talk a little bit more about BPA and some of the financial challenges facing BPA and how this proposal and really thinking about the energy side of it is helpful for Idahoans' pocketbook? What does that look like?
Well, as most people that use BPA power know, those power rates have been going up and going up substantially. In fact, it used to be when they came in for their budget annually, the rural electrics would come in and the president, whether it was Obama or Trump, or actually even back to President Bush, in their budget request, they always said, these rural electrics ought to be able to buy power on the open market instead of being stuck with BPA. And I would say, why in the world would you want to do that when BPA power is the cheapest in the world, And what I found out is I started having rural electrics come to me and say, yeah, we agree. We ought to be able to buy power on the open market, and come to find out that they can buy power cheaper on the open market than they can from the Bonneville Power Administration because of all the ancillary costs that BPA is saddled with. And so when I started looking at that and what are the things that are driving the cost of the BPA and their power rates up, it's not actually the production of the power by these dams. That's cheap. It's all those ancillary costs. And so how can we relieve the BPA of those costs? And if we remove those dams, how can you replace that power with firm power that has to be done? And that would take some time. That's why we give them $10 billion. We also give them $4 billion to upgrade their transmission system. Every utility that I've talked to, every IOU has said, the one thing you got to keep in place is the transmission system, and you got to upgrade and modernize the transmission system of the BPA. So we give them $4 billion for modernization of the transmission system, which is very important to the Bonneville Power Administration. But they're going to hit a financial rock here pretty quickly if we don't do something that's going to make, I think, power rates even go up more. If we can enact something like this, take some of those costs off of the Bonneville Power Administration, I think we can keep power rates lower than they currently are, certainly not going up anymore.
And Congressman, a question about whether it's really feasible to shift energy resources so quickly in a short time in the Pacific Northwest. You mentioned earlier small modular nuclear reactors. Is it feasible to get them up and running within the next 7 or 8 years before the 10 or 11 when the dams would be taken out?
Well, as you know, they're working on SMRs in Idaho, at the Idaho National Laboratory. They're doing that for NuScale and UAMPS that are promoting that. We're also looking at other technologies in our Energy and Water Committee. Yeah, I think that's fully feasible. They tell me that that they already have the NRC licensing for the small modular reactors, and I think you'll see a demonstration project built at the Idaho National Laboratory in the next 6 or 7 years. So yeah, I think it is very feasible to do that. If you don't have the power in place at the time to replace the loss of power from the dams, then you have to put off the removal of the dams, because that power has to be in place before you start removing the dams and the ability for them to produce power.
And is it possible for other sources of power to come into this mix as well? In your proposal, is it really focused on SMR, or is there also opportunity for wind or solar or other options?
I think there's opportunities for all options of power. As I mentioned SMRs, I mentioned battery storage, I mentioned pump storage, other types of energy, but wind and solar will certainly be a part of it. But what you've got to replace these megawatts of power that these dams produce is with firm power. That's power that can be ramped up and down as the need demands. Wind and solar doesn't really work that way as firm power, but battery storage does. And one of the challenges with wind and solar is that when the wind blows, it produces power. When the sun shines, it produces power. When the sun sets, it doesn't produce power. So how do you store that power that's produced when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining? Battery technology is going a long ways toward that. I've been amazed what I've been hearing from and talking to some of the people in the battery arena.
Great. So we've talked about salmon, we've talked about energy, we've talked about transportation and agriculture. What are some other benefits of removing the dams? There are some questions about, are there environmental benefits? What about recreation and tourism? What does that look like for Idaho in particular?
Well, when you take these dams out, the first challenge you're going to have is silt that's built up. And we put money in to make sure we can dredge behind the dams to remove the silt, or as much of it as possible, before you remove the dams, because you don't want to silt up the whole river all the way down. We've created a recreation corridor on the lower Snake River so that we can increase the recreational opportunities. There's also compensation in there for the marinas and stuff that currently exist along the lower Snake River, because those are going to have to be moved or removed, one of the two, because of the lowering of those pools of water. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here if we re-envision the Pacific Northwest and what we want this to look like for the future. But those ideas are going to come from people, frankly. And that's why like I said, why we've got this out here as a concept for people to look at and discuss.
And so in terms of really thinking about benefits, do you feel that there's a potential for benefit to small towns in Idaho? You talked about fish returns to your district. What could that look like for some of the small towns in Idaho, both on the agriculture side, but also those folks that are outfitters and guides and so forth?
Well, obviously for the outfitters and guides and communities along the river, you go to Riggins. I can remember seeing pictures of Riggins. In fact, when I was a kid, I can remember driving through Riggins when you couldn't stand on the bank because there's so many fishermen there for the salmon returns and stuff. And their economy has just been devastated by the loss of salmon runs. The same thing is true with other communities along the rivers. But for small communities in Idaho, I think it provides the certainty and security that rural agricultural needs, that they're not going to be sued every time they turn around, and that it provides that certainty for the future. So that people will want to go into agriculture. Someone once told me when this first came out, or one of the comments was, well, this could fallow thousands and thousands of acres in Idaho. And I went, how is that? How can making more water available for Idaho users fallow more land? That just didn't make sense. But all sorts of those types of arguments occur. What I'm trying to do, as I said, is create some certainty for Idaho agriculture. If I thought for 1 second, that this would harm Idaho agriculture, I would drop it in a heartbeat, because agriculture is the lifeblood of Idaho.
Congressman, so many questions about what is next. You mentioned working with the tribes in the Columbia Basin, working with the federal delegation in the Pacific Northwest, working with the governors, your fellow Idaho delegation, this infrastructure bill, but how does the sausage get made? What does that actually look like in terms of getting money appropriated, getting this into an infrastructure bill or some other sort of bill? What are those next steps? What happens behind the curtain if we're not watching C-SPAN every minute?
If you mentioned one thing that I need to comment on just a little bit on before I address that. One is the tribes. I've been very proud to work with the tribes in this. As you know, that is part of their history, their culture, their religion. They're called Salmon people for a reason. And we've worked with 16 tribes in the Pacific Northwest. I think I was the first one to address all of the chairmen of the 16 different tribes in one Zoom meeting that we had. And I was very proud to be able to do that. But we also have a legal responsibility. Almost every treaty that was signed with the tribes retained their fishing rights. Well, those fishing rights don't mean anything if there's no fish there. And so we've got to do everything both for a moral reason and for a legal reason, I think, to try to return these salmon. And that's why the tribes are so heavily involved in this and why we kept them involved in this effort. The next steps along the way is, as I said, for the next few months, we're going to be listening to people, taking in their thoughts, their concerns, their suggestions. And then at some point in time down the road, I can't tell you exactly how long that's going to be, depends on how complicated this gets, but we will start drafting legislation. And believe me, drafting the legislation is going to be a nightmare because it is so encompassing. But we have to take it in small chunks and draft it as a piece of legislation. Then we'd release that to the public to look at, and it would follow what we have been learning throughout this process. In the meantime, we would like to get the funding for this, even if we don't have the legislation done, set aside in an infrastructure bill. Then if nothing ever develops of it, you could release the money to be used other places. But we would like that money set aside in an infrastructure bill. That looks like our best shot at getting the funding. If we don't get it there, it's not the last opportunity, but that seems like the best one. But then we would work on trying to pass a piece of legislation. And obviously, we would have to have the delegation in the Pacific Northwest come together on this to the extent possible.
So, but it does sound like you can decouple the funding and the actual the bill itself.
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay, all right. Well, Congressman Mike Simpson, I really want to thank you for spending this time with City Club of Boise, our members, our listeners, our radio listeners. It's just been really a privilege to hear more about your salmon and energy concept.
Well, thank you very much. And again, if people want to go to our website, they can comment on what we're proposing and stuff. We enjoy hearing those and listening to them, and they make us think. So, and that's what we want. So make sure you log in and get your comments or just learn more about it. And when people have asked me the other day, what can they do to help and stuff? I said, learn more about the concept. Learn about what it's all about and why we're doing it. And that way, when you run into someone that says, this is just totally crazy, you can say, well, wait a minute, let's talk about it and see if it is. And I find when you sit down and actually talk to people and listen to their concerns and talk to them about why you're doing what you're doing, you can meet some common ground there. And that's what we're looking for.
So we will encourage folks to contact your office and to learn more and to go to your website. I think that what you just said is right in alignment with City Club's mission. You know, things happen when people start talking.
Yep. True.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you again so much for being with us today and for sharing the details of this proposal.
Thank you, Katherine. Thanks, City Club.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.